What you see before you is a man with an ill-fitted suit. Hi, I guess that's me. Now, what I'm going to be doing in this ill-fitted suit is present to you a metaphysical theory of everything. Now, I'm not the first person to do this, by a long shot. There have been many people who have done this. But I believe I am the first person to actually quantify it and use reason to build up a cohesive narrative of everything. Dimensionalism is the thought process that I went through to philosophically and empirically ask what things are made of. Like, what are the dimensions of objects? Now, metaphysical is a term that I was hesitant to use at first because metaphysics has often been coined and used by charlatans to say wooey things. But I am going to do my very best to not be wooey. I want to be clear, concise, and actually teach what things are made of and how things run in the real world. So metaphysics is one of the 4 branches of philosophy. The other 3 branches are logic, epistemology, and ethics. And the study of metaphysics does exactly what dimensionalism does. It looks at the dimensional properties of objects and also contemplates the nature of their existence. The prefix meta in the term metaphysics was used by Aristotle, I believe. In Greek, meta means to go beyond physics. The meta aspects of physics that I will specifically be thinking about and portraying to you is the zero-dimensional quantitative measurements, because math doesn't have any physical manifestation. And there's also the qualitative measurements that we can use to measure the psyche and pretty much any other measurement that we can think of that doesn't have an objective, okay, go from here to here. Or if something can be measured but it doesn't have an object to really go with it, that is a qualitative measurement that we would measure on that object. And a theory of everything is a purely physics concept that seeks to unify Einstein's theory of relativity with quantum field theory, because right now they are not unified, and there isn't a theory that can encompass everything that can be expressed in our physical reality. Now, however, even though dimensionalism as a theory goes beyond physics, it deduces what the main problems of unifying these 2 theories are. So in that case, you should probably listen to me if you're a physicist, because you'll probably more quickly conjure up what the actual grand unified theory of everything is if you take what I say into consideration. My name is Tim Snavely, and although I am not a physicist, nor a mathematician, nor a philosopher, I'm just a psychology major, I do consider myself a pretty reasonable logician. So if you follow along with me, I'll be able to explain everything to you. Now, as most charlatans usually, in some way or another, try to trick you in some way, shape, or form, I will do my best to not do that. I have such a deep want, a desire to seek out truth, that I don't want you guys to be lost and going after every single thing that someone says is true and just take it as fact, as factually true. Dimensionalism does not say that what I am going to present to you is the absolute truth of the matter. But it does encourage you to think for yourself and to go after truth your own way. Now, charlatans before me, like the amazing Grandy, specifically use their charismatic and great thinking skills to perform magic tricks, and to not just perform magic tricks, but also debunk other charlatans who were pompously claiming that they know everything. And I would like to think of myself in the same category as the amazing Grandy, but rather than using it to debunk other people's logic, I want to use it to, I reflected it back onto myself and kind of debunked my own theory and allowed other people to also debunk it, and I have revised and updated this theory that I am presenting to you multiple times. So critical assessment is invited. What you see before you is the real number line. It has every number that can possibly exist on this real number line because it has arrows at the end. Now, every number that can exist can either be negatively infinite, negatively transfinite, which is a well-ordered infinity because we can deduce that some infinities are greater than others. Wow, that's a shitty infinity. Infinity times infinity can be deduced to be greater than just infinity when infinity is treated as a number. It's not always that case, because infinity, when infinity is actually complexly infinite, these are of the same magnitude, and it should be actually greater than or equal to both of these sides. Now, so it could be, and if you don't believe me on the concept of a transfinite, you can just look up George Cantor's set theory, or there's also a good Vsauce video that you can look up that goes into the concept of Aleph null pretty well. So what I use to designate the transfinite is the Aleph symbol. So that things can be negatively infinite, negatively transfinite, negative everything. Now this is a symbol that I use for everything, because everything finite is presented by this symbol, and I completely made it up myself. It is the letter X being made by two infinity symbols. There's not much more to that. It's just the symbol that I use for this theory of everything, because I actually quantify everything. There it is. Ta-da! So keep in mind that everything is a range. If it was one specific thing, it would just be a thing, not everything. And this will be useful whenever I do things like everything times 0 is equal to 0. This equation is true. For everything finite, when you multiply that by 0, you get 0. But more on that later. So things can be negative of these three categories, 0, positive of these three categories, some indeterminate usage of a combination of these categories, or it can be definitively finite, like other than 0. It can be 1, 2, 3. It's like if you can determinate a number, that means it is not a range of numbers, it is one single number. Now regarding this number line that contains every number that we can possibly have, there are two of Gödel's incompleteness theorems that can best summarize a couple of additional premises that I am going to present to you in a little bit. And the first theorem is, for any math system F, there are things within the system that cannot be proven or disproven. Like, what is Aleph 1 plus 20? Like, we know exactly where Aleph null is. It's like right here at the very beginning of infinity, just beyond of what we are capable of knowing. But whenever we add 20 to it, we still get just Aleph 1. But we can't know that. We cannot definitively prove that with just these numbers. We can't know everything about math just by using math. And that's the second of Gödel's two incompleteness theorems, is that the consistency of the number line cannot be proved with just the number line. You have to be able to zoom out and encompass everything in the generic sense. What is being said, or what the rules are for f. Like, we can just as easily say that this negative infinity and this positive infinity loop back on each other, and they meet at another zero at some point that we do not know. We cannot prove that or disprove that. It's incomplete. We do not know. All right. Imagine a perfect computer that is the size of Uranus. Now, even this perfect computer would have its finite limitations. It would only be able to calculate determinately what is within its capability of calculating. So for this perfect computer, its range for what would be considered finite for it would be greater than ours, more likely than not. So what actually encompasses everything is subjective. Like for a 5-year-old, we would ask the 5-year-old, what is the highest number you can think of? And they would probably say 100 or 10. Something small like that. Because our ability to know things are determined by our level of knowledge of a system. If you don't know much about numbers, you're not going to iterate that high of a number to say that you know. Like personally, I would say that my highest finite number would be either a Googleplex worth of nines, like 9999999, a Googleplex amount of times, or just saying Rayo's number, depending on the context I'm using. For most everyday purposes, I just say the string of nines is my highest finite number. We're going to imagine that this perfect computer has only 3 digits, and the biggest number that it could possibly calculate is either 999 or 1000. Now the inverse of 1 over 999 and 1 over 1000 is the same in this perfect computer. It would be 0.001. But the only difference between these two numbers is that we can say from outside of the computer that 1 over 999 is 0.001 repeating. But it takes someone outside of the computer system to actually tell that that is what is going on. So for this perfect computer, this range of numbers would be the extent of what it was measuring. If it tried to calculate 1000, it would be beyond what this perfect computer is capable of measuring. And if it went below 0.001, that looks like a paradox, doesn't it? We're saying 1 over 1000 is put in terms of here, but we cannot at the same time say that the last digit is knowable. So if we were just continually adding new digits, we would say 9999, 1 over 9999 would be indistinguishable from 1 over 10,000. And that would just keep on going and going and going. Here. So other than that paradox that I just went over in my head, we'll just say for all intents and purposes that this finite computer cannot go beyond what is right here. 999.999. Now, what is the infinitesimal for this perfect computer? Well, it would still be 0.000. So like if you go this way, you go closer and closer to infinity. But if you go this way, you go closer and closer to 0. So 0 and infinity are reciprocals of each other. So this 0 category is just as complex as the whole of infinity. 0 is capable of being an infinite 0. So for this perfect computer, 0 would just be 0.000. Simple enough. But there could be numbers either over here or over here that would either make it a transfinite infinity or a transfinite 0, depending on where there are numbers that make it distinguishable from 0. Now, the infinitesimal I propose is the inverse of a maximally transfinite number. Yeah, it's better just to define it in terms of that is the infinitesimal, where the very last well-ordered transfinite 0 is turned into a 1 instead. So that's the infinitesimal. This is 0 the finite. If that was turned into a 0, that would be 0 the transfinite. And going beyond that, well, it is so disordered that we can't really determinately know anything about what is going on that far out in the number line. There could be squares and triangles out there. So if there were zeros that go on for infinity, that would be 0 the infinite. So one of the important ranges that I am going to use to explain everything is the range that contains all of the positive numbers. And that range is positive omega infinity. Now, if there's also the range that it includes 0 as well, and that term is called positive nomega infinity. So for what I'm about to teach you, it will not have the nomega, because that'll be done later. But just for the positive omega infinity, we can prove that infinity and 0 are inverses of each other by saying the limit of any function of any positive number over x as x approaches 0 goes towards infinity. And also the limit of any function x over anything positive as x approaches 0 is 0. Yeah, those are the inverses. Infinity and 0 are inverses of each other. Go figure. So these are the 7 indeterminate forms. 0 times infinity, infinity over infinity, 0 over 0, 0 to the 0, infinity to the 0, 1 to the infinity, and infinity minus infinity. Now, we're going to ask ourselves, what is the precise range that each of these values can be? And since we know that a little bit more now, that 0 and infinity are true inverses of each other, we'll be able to deduce, using logic, what the range of each of these forms are. So, 0 times infinity. Can it be infinity? Well, yeah, it can be. It can go all the way out here. Alright, but now the question is, can it be negative? Can 0 times positive infinity ever be negative? I would say not. Because where would you get the negative from? If all you have is a positive and 0 to work with, you'll either get 0 or a positive. So, with that in mind, the range, and since we know that I can reach 0, the value of 0 times infinity can be any of the positive numbers and 0. So I called this range, as I said earlier, nomega infinity. Positive nomega infinity. Because if we likewise did 0 times, if we made this a negative instead, 0 times negative infinity, the value would flip and go be this range, and be the range from 0 to negative infinity. But we'll just focus on the positive aspect for now. But keep this negative in mind for a little bit from now. Now, for why this is the case is because 0 and infinity are both infinite in this case. And the reason why zeros pop up as part of a lot on the indeterminate form is just as much as infinity is because they are both infinite. If we say that the positive infinity wins, the answer would be infinitely complex infinity. It could be a transfinite infinity, and it could also be a value that is positively finite. So we can say the value of 0 times infinity is pi. We can also say it is 4 and 20, because it is all acceptable within the range of values. That's what makes 0 times infinity an indeterminate form, is because, well, there's a huge range that it can fall into. But not all indeterminate equations are created equal, as you will soon find out. But infinity divided by infinity is likewise this value, positive and omega infinity, because we don't know which infinity type is going to win. If the top infinity wins, then the value will be positive infinity. But if the bottom infinity wins over here, then the value will be 0. So we will now ask ourselves, what is the form 0 divided by 0 capable of being equal to? 0 over 0 equals what? Or what can it be equal to? Well, we already deduced up here that 0 times infinity can equal 0. 0 is in the acceptable range of values for the form 0 times infinity. So if it can be positive infinity, if you multiply times 0 on both sides, we would get a true equivalence of 0 equals 0. So the same would go for the negative infinity. 0 times negative infinity can equal 0. So it is acceptable. It could be negatively transfinite. It could be negatively finite. It could be positively finite. It could be positively transfinite. It could be 0. So in other words, the form 0 divided by 0 is maximally indeterminate, and all of the numbers on the number line are acceptable answers to this equation. It covers this big freaking range, and that is the range I call omega everything. And that is distinct from the finite everything that we only are capable of knowing. So this form can be used as a sort of mathematical Big Bang of sorts, where everything that can happen within the mathematical realm will happen. So if this form was applied to all of the physical measurements that we can use as well, beyond the quantitative measurements, everything would come out of it as a result. Like, not just everything that we can see, but everything that we can't see as well. It's got everything covered. What is 0 to the 0th power? Let's see, what is 1 to the 0th power? It is 1. What is 20 to the 0th power? It is 1. What is 0 to the 0th power? Well, it looks like it'll just continue the line and say that it is also equal to 1. However, these are multiplicative identities, but 0's multiplicative identity is also 0, because we also maintain that anything times 0 can equal 0. So if we were to imagine everything in terms of binary, does it hold something or does it not hold something? And we try to add absolutely nothing to it. Would 0 be within absolutely everything? Yes, it would be there. So it would be a 1. but it would also be capable of being outside of everything. So in that case, it would not be there to be accounted for because it would be outside of everything. So in that case, it would be a 0. So the form of 0 to the 0th power is minimally indeterminate. It is either 0 or 1. That's it. And now, because we know these two things, the values of the two indeterminate forms of 0 to the 0th power, we can now calculate the two acceptable values for infinity to the 0th power, which is still kind of contradictory, but I'll explain it a little bit. So we could say that 0 to the 0th power is 1 over 1 and 0 over 1. And infinity is the reciprocal of those. So infinity to the 0th power would also be 1 over 1, so it would also be equal to 1. But it would also be 1 over 0, which would be positive infinity. Now, after thinking about this for a little bit, it wouldn't be just any sort of infinity. It would be the smallest possible infinity that can possibly exist on this number line. So for this number line, the smallest infinity for us from our finite perspective would be right here. And I'm just going along with Cantor and saying that this value is Aleph null, because the value of 1 over Aleph null would also be equal to 0. Now, the reason why 1 to the infinity power is indeterminate is because when we treat infinity as a determinate number, the value does not become just 1 as you would expect. It would not just be 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. It suddenly becomes E, the value of the golden ratio. But just as it is right now, from the way that I have seen it and constructed it on this number line, this form is determinate. The value is 1. It does not equal E. Because we are constraining the infinity to the finite function we are telling it to perform, which is 1 times 1 times 1 times 1. It's never going to become not 1 in that line of infinite times 1s. I give a better detailed description of why I do not think that 1 to the infinity is equal to E in the paper, which I will link in the description below. But for now, we will just say that it is not indeterminate. It is very much determinate. And I give better explanations why in the paper. So check it out if you want to delve deeper into my thoughts below. Now the last form is infinity minus infinity. Now this indeterminate range is almost as vast as the 0 over 0, sorry. Now the infinity minus infinity, well, where do we say the first infinity can start? We will assume that the first infinity is the largest infinity that we can possibly conjure up. So that's where it would start. And now we're going to subtract infinity away from that. Where would that bring us? Well, it would definitely be smaller than just a regular old complex infinity. Now the reason this is the one that I am least sure of on this scale, because the value can still be positive infinity. Like the range could hypothetically stop right here for the value of infinity minus infinity. However, at the same time, it should also be well-orderedly smaller than infinity. So that was my logic of saying that the value can come down to the largest positive transfinite number. So the full range of infinity minus infinity, it can go negative infinity for forever, and the top range can go all the way to the positive infinity. And I call this range negatively ordered omega everything. Some sort of, I confuse myself with those terms sometimes. So that is the range of infinity minus infinity. Finally, we are done with part one. For the actual physics concepts, I first wanted to look for and determine what is the smallest number of quantum measurements that could be used to define our physical reality. And a good place to start for me for that was to look up the SI system, and because their system, their base units have 7 types of measurements. They have, now these are the 7 base units of the SI system. So now that I have this in front of me, I first asked, well, was there anything else that I could think of that could actually be added to this list? Or is this list already too many, and can I remove some even more from this? And I couldn't think of anything to add, but after much contemplation, only these 4 are the only primary dimensional units that we can use to measure everything in our physical reality. These 3 down here can be mathematically derived as being some combination of these 4 dimensional units. So the candela could be mathematically quantified with the 4 primary dimensional units by saying it is mass times length squared divided by time to the 4th. And the mole can be mathematically expressed as the quantity of mass times the volume of the particles of a substance. And the temperature can be mathematically defined as the average kinetic energy of the particles of a substance. And kinetic energy is another secondary dimensional unit, which can be derived as mass times L squared over T squared. That's energy. E equals mc squared. C is the speed of light, and speed is distance over time. Since it's that squared, E equals m times L squared over T squared. And since temperature is the average kinetic energy of the particles of a substance, and the particles of the substance we've already deduced is right here, the temperature is equal to this over that. So now that we have deduced that the number of primary dimensional units is 4, mass, electric current, length, and time, we will now ask how many of each dimension there are. Well, space, if we can imagine forward and back, left and right, up and down, there isn't any more than that. Height, width, and depth are the 3 spatial dimensions. So there's 3 spatial dimensions. For mass, there is 1. And we can imagine that with the help of, the best way we can imagine that why there's only 1 dimension of mass is because the same reason why massive space objects are spherical. The sun is spherical because it has, we'll say that the sun is 2-dimensional, and that is the center of the sun. Now, the mass of all parts of the sun are equally coming down at the same point of singularity in the center of the sun. But each one of those points, each one of these lines are a 1-dimensional mass line. So we can't say that we cannot add that there are 3 mass dimensions, because those other 2 dimensions that we see of mass are spatially oriented. But the mass itself is only 1-dimensional. And we can see that, pretend on, also there is Jupiter over here. We got things pulling in to the gravity of the sun and things pulling into the gravity of Jupiter. And we will see that there will eventually come a point of least resistance where we will find ourselves, where we can see that both Jupiter, the sun, ourselves, the moon, and all the other planets except for the objects in the Kuiper belt are also all on the plane of, they're all on a plane of least resistance because of the one dimension of mass that is pulling on everything else on the fabric of mass electric spacetime. So, there's only one mass dimension. Now, how many electric dimensions are there? Well, there's two. There's this thing called electromagnetism. Have you heard of it? Electric and magnetic waves travel at 90 degrees alongside each other. The reason why there are two electric dimensions and not two mass dimensions is because we need two dimensions to actually fully encompass basic electric currents and the magnetic forces that are correlated with them. If there was only one dimension of electric currents, we would only be able to see, but the magnetic forces would not be happening. Now here's the interesting question. How many time dimensions there are? I don't know. But thanks to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, we can deduce that there are at least two. Two is the bare minimum that we require to actually explain everything that we know right now. Because if there was only one dimension of time, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle would not be the uncertainty principle. It would just be the certainty principle. We would know that this thing, x, would directly lead to this y all the time. But on quantum systems, this does not always happen. So in quantum systems, things are not always determinate, like we are classically, as we classically know it on the macro scale. Like particles travel as waves. Like if you shine a light into a couple of slits, they won't go through those slits as, oh, there's going to be a beam of light over here and a beam of light over here. No, they're going to have an interference pattern beyond those two slits. And that is called the double slit experiment. And you can kind of see that light is a wave by holding your finger up to your eye like this and focusing on a light source. You can see that there is a interference pattern between yourself and the light source. I always thought that was pretty cool. So if you think about, like, if you look at a thing of light and you put a very slim place for the light to actually go through, you will not see a straight source of light, of photons going straight in through the hole. It'll look like which is pretty cool. Time into the future is indeterminate. We cannot say that x will always equal to y all the time, and because we cannot say x causes y all the time, we need two time dimensions to account for that uncertainty. Now, could there be more than two time dimensions? Absolutely. But it would all be speculation at this point. In fact, even me saying this right now, teaching that there are two time dimensions, is contrary to what is commonly taught in physics right now, because right now, physics is constrained to Einstein's 3 times 1 space-time. But I am expanding that to counter everything that we can actually measure within everything. And it requires a mass electric space-time. You're welcome. So in conclusion, our physical reality is made up of 8 dimensions. 1 of mass, 2 of electric current, 3 of space, and 2 of time. Ba-dum-bum. So that's one of the main problems of people trying to conjure up a theory of everything in physics is that they are either using too many or too few dimensions to actually encompass everything that we can physically verify. Now, to actually encompass everything that goes on in the atom, we need about 7 or 8, it depends on how you count it, things going on inside the atom to actually encompass everything that we know of in the atom. I'm just going to quickly skip through this part because it is basically copy and paste knowledge from what we already know, plus a little bit of extra logic to help push physicists forward in their way of thinking. So inside an atom, there is the electromagnetic force that keeps protons and electrons attracted to each other, and it also repels protons away from each other. But those repulsions are counteracted by the electrons keeping them in place. And there's the strong nuclear force, which helps these positive protons that want to repel against each other. It helps keep them close together. And there's a residual strong nuclear force that keeps these protons and neutrons, it keeps the whole nucleus stable. Now, considering the strong nuclear force, there's also this thing called color charge that comes about. So there's, for leptons and quarks, there are 3 generations of matter. So you could say that there are 3 color charges to those types of matter. But for like gluons, for example, there are 8 different colors that they can manifest as. So it might just be a coincidence that there are 8 colors of gluons and 8 dimensions of mass electric spacetime. But I'll leave that for physicists to contemplate, because that is beyond my capability and understanding. Now there's also the weak nuclear force, which allows for particles within the atom to decay in their evolution and allow nuclear fission to occur. So it can release alpha particles and beta particles from the atomic structure. And it's called the weak nuclear force because it can only work at such close distances. Yeah, that's all I have to say about the weak nuclear force. Now this is something new to dimensionalism. I'm proposing that I know what the Higgs Force is and that it is actually a thing that happens inside the atom. So here's the logic on that. If we took an electron set apart, it's called a beta particle. And this beta particle, without having any of the other forces within it, it has mass. It has mass all by itself. And from what we know about mass, mass is equivalent to energy in a way. So E equals mc squared again. So we can make mass equivalent to energy by dividing c squared on both sides. So if a particle, if an electron has m going on in it, if we know it has m, then there is an equivalent amount of energy going on to give that particle its mass. And this is what I propose is the Higgs force. Now the Higgs force, to better define it in terms that the community will understand, is it only accounts for about 1% of the mass of an entire atom. Most of the mass that is generated from the atom are made from all of the other forces of the atom. But because there is a beginning mass to begin with the particles, there's an equivalent amount of energy or force going into it to give those particles their mass. And that's the Higgs force. Now going back to what physicists already know, something else that goes on inside the atom is the particle spin that goes inside the atom, which tells us about the orbital and the intrinsic angular momentum of the particle. Now, if you're interested in particle spin, there's plenty of other videos on the internet that can go deeper into those concepts for you, because I am not going to be the best teacher for these concepts. But the chirality and the helicity of a particle is an interesting topic to learn about, so go check those out too. Now there's also a new force that I'm proposing, which is the dark force. And it is the force of 2 points of space being accelerated and being moved apart from each other. This is equivalent to what we observe as dark energy at the moment, because it has just been recently discovered, by recently I mean within the past century, that the universe's expansion appears to be accelerating from our point of reference. So if you're out in the middle of nowhere between galaxies really far away, to where you cannot feel the effects of anything, the dark force is saying that between any point x and another point x, the length will increase as a product of time squared. It's the acceleration of the universe. This is something I'm currently thinking on, and I don't think I might have the brains to be able to figure out how best to express the dark force as a form of inverse square law, but I'll just leave that for now. I'm not 100% sure about this right now. The dimensionalism model assumes that a point of space is the zero-dimensional point, 0D point space. So if a fundamental space is found to be that is larger than zero, an acceleron boson of sorts might be found and would make the dark force a fifth primary force of nature. Now I say a primary force of nature because the fundamental forces of nature are currently they're in need of revision, because in case you haven't noticed, I believe the dark force is the last thing. Yeah, the dark force is the last thing that goes on inside the atom that I can really define. So, in case you haven't noticed, gravity is not there. Gravity is not needed to explain what is going on inside the atom. So, the four primary forces of nature that I propose right now are the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, and the Higgs force, as I defined it earlier. So there is, in essence, quantum mass, but there is not quantum gravity. The best way to explain that there is no graviton is by using the analogy of water waves and compressional waves. Now, physicists, ask yourselves, do water waves require a boson to make the waves? Is there a water boson carried in the waves of a water wave? No. Are there any waves inside of a pressure wave, a compressional wave? Is there a boson that is carried in that wave? No. No, there is not. So, likewise, is it absolutely necessary that there is a graviton carried inside of the wave of a gravitational wave? No, it is not necessary. So likewise, if there is some sort of water boson or compressional boson, those particles would not be fundamental particles. They would, more likely than not, be quasi-particles, a mixture of different fundamental particles. And I would suggest that any graviton that would be found would have that sort of quasi-particle property. Now, I already covered a bunch of the things that I'm going to go over in part 4, so I'll be able to skip a lot of it. But we already gone over the zero-dimensional point. This is the point. from this point, the zero-dimensional point, which has been greatly, infinitely largened up, just so that you can see it. This has points going out, and it goes outward from itself for infinity, and we'll just call that negative infinity and positive infinity to be consistent, and it goes inward on itself, closer and closer to zero. That's what the point is all about, the zero. Now, the one-dimensional line is whenever you take any other point besides the point, and you say that everything on the line, you say that this point and this point shoot infinity vectors at each other. So this infinity vector going in this direction goes like that, and this point's infinity vector going this way looks like that. And that's a one-dimensional line. We're on our way, kids. Now, a two-dimensional line makes a 90-degree angle from a point on this one-dimensional line. Now, this point is called the point of singularity because it is zero from, it doesn't matter if you're on the x-axis or the y-axis. If you're at the point of singularity, you're at point zero. So for a two-dimensional plane, the point of singularity is 0, 0. For if we went ahead and pretended that there was a line popping off the board, pretend there's a line popping off the board, so this is a three-dimensional model. This point of singularity would be then the point 0, 0, 0. So to expand what I said earlier in part 2, the point of singularity is the Big Bang. The point at where mass, electric current, space, and time all equal 0. Boom. Bang. Oh yeah, I guess there's also the sub-theory within the theory of dimensionalism, which is the theory of omniversal supersymmetry. I guess I'll talk about that then. And the theory of omniversal supersymmetry says that for everything that can exist in the universe, there is an equal amount of positive and negative charge, positive and negative mass, positive and negative space, and positive and negative flowing time, that if all of those things collided back together in the same space, everything from that net collision would equal 0. The two interesting things that come up with this theory says that time, there's a equivalent amount of time, a time thing going forward, going backward on the other side of the Big Bang. That is almost identical, except that it's negative from our perspective. And there's also the idea of negative mass, which is something that hasn't been really observed yet. That is a falsifiable theory that dimensionalism proposes, that there is particles of negative mass that exist. And I also propose that the way that they will work is by opposite mass types will repel each other. So if we immediately created a single particle of negative mass, it would be repulsed by the mass of the Earth. It would be very much anti-gravity. If it was held within a vacuum, it would find its point of least resistance at the center of the vacuum. And a test I propose to actually look for negative mass particles for particle physicists in the future is to get negative temperatures. That's all I can recommend. Temperature is basically the amount of thermal energy of a system, like we talked about earlier. M times L squared over D squared. Yeah. So, if the space that is taken up by the particle is positive, and the particle is also going forward with us in time, this is also positive, that would only leave mass turning negative. That would require everything in the energy system that we are measuring to go into the negative. If that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. So finally, with all of the physics and math stuff out of the way, I can get into the more philosophical aspects of dimensionalism that are based off of those more knowledge-based parts. Here's an argument that is loosely based off of the fine-tuning argument, that actually takes apart the incomplete parts of the theory and makes it a little bit better. So, instead of arguing for the concept of having a creator, we're going to argue that we are instead in a simulation. And if we are in a simulation, we are then necessarily created, because somebody had to create the simulation in order for us to be in there. So we will say that real space is something that exists. It is something that was first calculated by a function. We'll say that 0 divided by 0 created the function, was the idea or the concept that created the function of absolutely omega everything. So we will say that whatever space this is real space. So there are two premises that we can go about explaining what is going on with our space. How is our space working the way it is? Because the fundamental constants that we know of are inexplicably interlocked with each other. I have a picture that is in the paper that makes all of the connections, that all of the equations that I was aware of that equate certain fundamental constants with other fundamental constants. So premise 1, our fundamental constants are actually constant. They do not vary. And premise 2, real space calculates an infinite amount of variables to actually make omega everything. Real space, calculating, blah, 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 spitting out everything. There's a lot of variables that go into that. We assume that that number is infinite in this argument. So from these two premises, there are 4 possible conclusions that could come about if you take both of these things into account. Well, all 3 of these things. So given these 3 premises, there are 5 possible conclusions that we can come about. One of them I just figured out. And the first conclusion that is probable from these 2 premises are that the physical constants will vary, and that premise 1 is actually incorrect. If we give enough time, the physical constants will vary. What would happen if premise 1 is incorrect? Conclusion 1b, physics will never vary, and makes premise 2 incorrect. If premise 2 is incorrect, it would just mean that real space is actually calculated within a finite amount of variables, like 8, which we've already deduced for our particular reality. So if premise 2 is incorrect, either our physics will never vary, or there is actually a finite amount of variables that is calculated to actually make omega everything. Now, conclusion 1c assumes that both of these premises are correct, and we are just really lucky. And conclusion 1d is that both of these premises are true, and we are not in real space, because of the fundamental constants being constant, but they could hypothetically vary. If they are constant, we are not in real space. And conclusion 1e is that both of these premises are wrong and it is all BS. And it's all BS is our fundamental constants do vary. Real space is calculated with a finite amount of variables, but it doesn't actually make omega everything. It is something completely different from what I am proposing. But I have no idea what that is. This is just the best proposal that I could conjure up. And I just need to give you guys that ability to say, hey, everything that I'm saying is BS. But that is up to you guys to decide for yourselves. So if you in particular agree and are most convinced by conclusion 1D, there is some physical creator that is manifested in real space that created our space. Now, we do not know the precise motivations or the will of such a creator, but considering that these are pretty much all the possibilities, like these conclusions contain all the possibilities that our reality can encompass, if you choose C1D, we need creators. That's all there is to it. But even if you removed C1D and you only had these other, well, we'll just leave out the BS form for now. If you're still here and you're still thinking it's BS, then, well, I guess you're just wasting your time. If you think that we are either lucky, our physical constants will vary over greater spans of time, or our physical constants as a concept never vary. So what executed the 0 divided by 0 function? Is it possible for it to actually go by itself? Because by itself, it is still a function that still had to be thought of and contrived. So if you want to think of, like, even if you think that we are just lucky in the grand scheme of things, in omega everything, what executed the 0 divided by 0 function? And that is still an indeterminate mystery. That is what I would propose is something as a first consciousness. And that is honestly the best argument for God that there is that some first consciousness created this function and thought of this function. Now, if you want to say that this first consciousness has a will, has a name, I think you're lying to yourself, personally. Because I think the best that you can ever get for a first consciousness is being able to acknowledge that there was some first consciousness that created this function in a 0D space of nothingness. And that is where I also propose that where our consciousness comes from a 0D point in space. Now, there might be falsifiable experiments that we could actually extract the consciousness from a single part of a brain or something. I don't know. But yeah, consciousness is an interesting thing to think about. But here's the thing. Is it possible that for the 0 divided by 0 function to be executed without a consciousness creating the function in the first place? So what I'm saying, is it possible to take nothing and split it without doing anything to it? So I'm going to, I mean, if you're a coworker of mine right now, you'll probably know this thought experiment and the answer to this question. But for everyone else, this is a brand new thought experiment. Okay. I'm going to give you a thought experiment. After I give it to you, I want you to pause the video and to think about it yourself. Before you is a non-existent apple. I want you to take this apple and split it into two without doing anything to it. Remember, you can't do anything to it. Go ahead. Do it. But you told me not to do it. Well, you can do it. You just gotta see it that way. Because the mathematical proof is I showed you 0 apples. But I told you to observe this state of the apples. Because 0 is equivalent to 0 over 2. How about that? So whenever you have nothing times nothing equals nothing, you can have the first 0 up here be in its divided state without doing anything to it. So in that case, even the existence of God is indeterminate. It is 0 to the 0th power. Either there's a first consciousness within the 0D point that was able to execute this function, or there wasn't. It can happen either way, and we don't know which way it is. Maybe it's both. They are the same. So, whether you believe in the idea of agnostic atheism or agnostic deism, you are correct, depending on your point of view. But to the dismay of billions of theists in this world, I'm sorry, you got nothing. You are wrong. Honestly, for everything that is everything that I need to explain in this video, that is it. That is the theory of dimensionalism. Now, I do have a couple other videos that could be used as supplement that could go on at the end of this video, but not significantly much has changed since I uploaded those particular videos, and I will link those 3 in the description. I did a video on the relativity part of dimensionalism. I've gone about that here, but I already did a video on it. And I also, the other relative truths, that part hasn't changed a lot. And the meaning of life has only had a couple more possible meanings of life added to it that I have added in the paper, but it wasn't in the original video that I made. So if you want to see the videos, you can go your own way. If you want to read the document to this theory, you can go your own way. If you want to do absolutely nothing, you can go your own way. Yeah, that's... And now you know everything better. How about that? What are we going to do with this? Let me tell you. Wearing this suit in this house and getting my hair done without ever leaving the house, it was an experience, yeah. This suit is too damn tight. If I ever have to go out in public and teach this stuff, I'm going to have to get a new suit. I guess I can teach about the psychological tricks that charlatans use, and rather than leave them hidden, I can share them with you. So there's this, perception is everything, okay? So the reason why I put on a suit for this particular episode is because I expect that this video will eventually be my most viewed video, eventually. So, and it'll also be the first time a lot of people see me. So, if you see someone, you are judging them based off their perception. I usually don't like to get dressed up. I usually stay in my cooler uniforms, and I wear what I am comfortable in. I am not comfortable in what I am wearing now. But I am able to still flow and function and think, which is like still the most important part of doing this. But like, don't just listen to someone just because they are dressed up nice or because they even make good arguments. Even if what I said today seems really rational and good to you, still keep a skeptical, still take what I said with a skeptical grain of salt. Like I said earlier, I am a charlatan. I am a quack. But I am being open with you on those concepts. And hopefully being open with those concepts can show you my genuity, that I am also being open to changing some aspects of the theory that I presented to you earlier. Because honestly, a lot has changed since I first started uploading videos on dimensionalism. Like there's a whole part that is now obsolete. And whenever I first started the theory, there were 11 dimensions of mass electric spacetime, because I thought the mole had made the cut to be a quantum dimensional unit, because no one had ever broken it down into its mass and space components before. So it took me deducing that, okay, mole matter is stuff that has mass and takes up space. And those are two distinct qualities of the same phenomena. And those are two different quantum physics primary dimensional measurements. So it's like, once I figured that out, I'm like, and that's still not as bad as the time, because I thought that there were only 10 dimensions of mass electric spacetime for a while, because the mathematical deductions that I deduced were that, like as you saw in the candela earlier, that there were 4 time dimensions that were used to calculate the candela. So I thought that 4 was the amount of time dimensions that there were, just based off of the math. But someone on Quora, or however you say Quora, showed me that there are instances where, like, length to the 4th can be used to measure physical phenomena of our reality. And I'm like, well, if that's the reality, then either 4 space dimensions are the reality we live in, and we are just really unaware about it, or I was willing to let him be correct, because he was correct on that instance. If there are dimensions that pop up in the math, it doesn't mean that those math components have an equivalent connection to our physical reality, even though they can be used to measure physical phenomena. So after that deduction, I had to say, okay, is there even more than one time dimension? And then I remembered the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and it's like, yeah, there's still some uncertainty, but whether or not that is only a 2-dimensional causality wave function or more is still unknown. But it's still assumed to be only 2, because 2 is the bare minimum we actually need to describe everything. Until next time, kumbaya, mother duckers. Because there is in fact a quack behind me. Hello, little quack. You got a monocle. It's very cute. Only because I say it's cute. It's actually kind of ugly, not gonna lie. How are you even holding that on your thing? Wouldn't it just fall right off because you don't actually have cheekbones to keep it up?